start. All right, and then this. Okay. All right. Let's try it for the third time here. See if we can get things going. It's all Tab's fault. If he were just here on time, everything would have run smoothly. Because you're always here at the beginning, Tabs, but everything got messed up today. So it's all your fault if it doesn't work. Obviously, joke long. Okay. So narrative analysis. We spent the last few weeks with our focus on character analysis, and this week want to turn our attention to the setting analysis. And really, I should have done the setting analysis first, because that's sort of the more basic and general approach, but we didn't, so that's the way it goes. But when we talk about setting analysis, there's a few particular aspects we are looking for. When we talk about setting, the setting of a story, what are we talking about? Anybody want to answer that? When we say setting, what are we referring to when we talk about a setting of a story?
The time it happened, where it happened, the circumstances.
Okay, the circumstances, yeah, the events, circumstances.
Events, yeah.
And even to the culture, right? There's a cultural setting, like what group of people, what people group are we is involved here? You know, is this a group of Jewish unbelievers? Is this a group of disciples? You know, who are the people involved, and what do we know about the culture? Those are the basic elements of the setting of a story. We can call it different things, but basically there's the physical aspects of the story. That's basically where does the story happen? And it's more than just the location, but what places or objects are there. So for example, well, I won't go to John yet. We're going to look at it as an example, but it's not just, okay, these people were located in Jerusalem. Where were they at in Jerusalem? Say it's the temple. What was happening in the temple? Are there people there? It's more than just a geographical location. It's also, there are other elements to the setting. You know, are we in a garden? Are there trees around? Is it a barren field? Okay, so it's not just you know, they're located in the city of in the city of Capernaum, but maybe there's other specifics. You know, maybe like in Mark 1, they're in Peter's house in Capernaum along the shore, and you know, so there are other details, physical details that you want to make sure to take note of in the story. As I said, as I mentioned, there are cultural details to consider. In what culture does the story happen? All right, in particular, what customs there, social values, belief systems, and this is significant and pertinent for our story in John. This is something we have to understand the cultural context in order to understand the point in John 4. So this is really a key element in the setting. Now, sometimes the setting, the cultural aspects are not a huge issue, but sometimes they are. In Jonah, the culture is very important. Understanding the culture of the Ninevites, understanding the culture of the Israelites and their attitude towards the Ninevites. That's an important setting. It's kind of like a background context kind of element, really, but we want to pay attention to it in the setting. And then, as Pastor Robbie mentioned, the temporal element, that is, when does the story happen? All right. And again, not just the time of day or the date, but were there any significant events, either national or local events that took place or near. Like, for example, we often will see in John's gospel, he'll say at the time of the feast or during the Passover. So that's an important time element. It's an event taking place, and that is significant. It can relate very much to what's going on within the story. All right. And then finally, are there any other aspects to the setting? This is kind of just a miscellaneous category. Anything in the wider context of the story that will be helpful to understand as far as the setting goes. We have a couple of examples of that in the John 4 account that we'll see in a minute. Okay, so these are the really, and I would say in re-evaluating the narrative analysis, I would do this first, the setting analysis, before I do the character analysis. The setting analysis, I think this is a little easier. It's also a little more general, and I think it would be the best place to start. Start with setting analysis and then go to the characters. So with that, let's go ahead, and as we've been doing the last several weeks, let's go ahead and read again the story in John 4. And this time, as you're reading, look for these setting elements, these elements of setting here. In fact, what I'm going to do is have us read from this side. And again, just we'll read, say, what do I have it as? 4, 5, 6, about. Let's go ahead and read 5 verses each as we go through the story. And I'll leave the setting elements to the side there for you to refer to as we're reading. All right. Tabs, we'll start with you. If you can read 1 to 5, then Ince.
Yes, Pastor.
Then Ince, then Manny, Renee, and Harris. And a BJ. He could, in that order. All right, so you want to go ahead and start us off, Tabs?
Okay, Pastor.
Thank you.
John chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph.
Verse 6 to 10, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied of his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water."
Verse 11,
Okay.
she said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well, and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty nor come all the way here to draw."
Verse 16, he said to her, "Go and call your husband. Go and call your husband." and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you have correctly said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said correctly, truly. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship.
Verse 21, Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us.
Verse 26, Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman, but no one said, Why do you seek, or why are you talking with her? So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, Come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? They went out of the town and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, Has anyone brought him something to eat?
No problem. Why don't you go to 35 since you already went over?
35.
Keep going.
Do you not say, There are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Verse 36, already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper may rejoice together. Verse 37, for here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. Verse
Okay,
39.
let me have a Tong. Can you read 39 to 42?
Yes, Pastor.
Thanks, BJ.
From that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. He told me all the things that I have done. So when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. Many more believed because of his word. And they were saying to the woman, It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, so as we think about these 4, really 3 elements in the miscellaneous category in this particular account, and again, we're looking at the setting of the story as a whole. When we do scene analysis, we'll be looking at the specific setting of each scene. But in the setting analysis of the story, we're just kind of looking at it, the story as a whole. Okay, so as we consider that, this particular story, what are the physical elements of the setting here? Let's see, we'll go down to here. Anybody pick up anything as we look at the story? There's several elements of the setting given at the beginning of the story, which is pretty typical. Let's see, I don't remember who read the first few verses here. Is that you?
I did,
Tap?
Pastor.
All right, Tap.
Yes, Pastor.
What do you see as far as the physical aspects of the story, the setting?
Pastor, the physical setting would be in Sychar, the city of Samaria. And then it was near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well, where Jesus was sitting because he was tired from the journey.
Okay, good. At Jacob's well, correct?
Yes, Pastor.
Yeah. So they're at Jacob's well. Jesus is sitting down. I don't know if he's sitting on a rock or the ground on a tree stump. Okay, good. Anything else? From anybody else as far as the physical setting, the story, anything later on comes to mind?
After the time element.
Yeah, that'll be under temporal. We'll cover that in a minute. Right now, we're just going to focus on the physical aspects of the story.
We are also in a mountain, Pastor Tim, mountain of Samaria.
Yeah, that we learn in what, verse 20, right?
Yeah,
They are at the base or near a mountain. And if we were to do a study here, we would realize this is Mount Gerizim. Okay, this might be a place you might want to reference some resources to get some more details or look at other passages. This parcel of ground that Jacob gave to Joseph is near Shechem, most likely. If you refer to Genesis 33:19, which mentions that. And also, too, what do we know about Jacob's well? Why is it called Jacob's well? What do you see in verse 12? Why is it called Jacob's well?
They trace their.
He gave them the well, and he drank from the well himself.
Yeah. Yeah, this isn't a deep theological question. Jacob dug the well. That's why it's called Jacob's well. So nothing deep here, but it's a detail that the lady, the woman points out, right? Jacob dug this well. Where are your tools that you're going to dig this well for living water? It's kind of the behind what her question was, right? You have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where do you get this living water? In other words, where are you going to make a well that has this other kind of water? Are you greater than Jacob? He dug this well here. So those are some of the physical details. You could also mention, if you wanted, the water pot. That's in the story. I don't know if anything else is in there that matters, but you can mention, I think the water pot is in verse 27, if I remember right. 28. So, all right, any other physical elements in the story that you guys see? Again, consider and don't overlook the fact that John here has been very, very specific about the location. That's something that you would want to think about in regards to the story, is why he might have been so specific. Is there any significance to the fact? Not only does he mention the town, he mentions the actual location near that city. And he even mentions a specific place in that location. So perhaps he is setting up the fact that we know that the parcel of ground is likely Shechem, which was at the base of Mount Gerizim, which is a significant point because of the question of worship that she brings up later. So you need to know, okay, where is this parcel of ground that he's referring to? You need to go back in Genesis and try to figure that out. And we learned it's, like I said, near Shechem. And so that was at the base of Mount Gerizim, which we find out is a place where the Samaritans established a place of worship on Mount Gerizim. In order, because they didn't go back to Jerusalem after the split of the kingdoms, Jeroboam established worship in the northern tribes, and he established places of worship outside of Jerusalem. And then by the time the Assyrians came and took the northern tribes into exile, and then they returned, they ended up building their own temple on Mount Gerizim. And so there is some significance and importance to the specific details that John is pointing out here in regards to the location. Now, some of that you may not know offhand. You would have to study that. You'd have to kind of use a concordance, or perhaps even cheat a little bit and use a pictorial encyclopedia or something that could tell you what this particular ground is in reference to. Okay, but it is referred to, I think, in Genesis 33. Any questions or comments on that?
Is it significant also that Shechem was where they buried the bones of Joseph?
Oh yeah, that's
after
right.
they brought out his bones outside of Egypt.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be that would be something to include, certainly. And then think about, again, at this stage, we don't know what is significant and what isn't necessarily, but it is good to just identify as much information as you can, because sometimes what might seem to be a small detail is actually important to the story. Just like I mentioned in the example last week, the blind man going to the pool of Siloam, which at the time might seem like an insignificant detail, but knowing that Siloam means sent, it then becomes actually an important clue from the author in the story as to what the story is about. So don't take anything for granted at this point. As you're looking at the setting, just try to identify all the details that you can. And like I said, ask the question, why? Why does he include this level of detail here? Is there any significance to the fact that Joseph was buried near here? And he mentions that Jacob gave this ground to Joseph. So it may be a big significant point. It may not be. It may just be part of the author sort of giving a picture of where they were located. All right, but don't assume either way. Don't assume that it's like the most significant thing in the story and you're going to preach a sermon on the well of Jacob. Jacob's well was there, brothers and sisters, and we must not overlook the significance of this well because Jacob dug this well. Yes, he dug deep. And anyway, sorry. But so don't overemphasize something if you're not sure, but don't ignore it either. At this stage, it could be a very important detail, or maybe it's just part of the developing the scene for the story that the author's trying to do. But for me, it does seem unusual that he is this specific. It seems like there's something more here than just giving us the setting of the story only. Okay. All right. Let's consider, let's go first to temporal, then we'll do the cultural. That's a little more involved. Temporal aspects to the story. All right, Ence, you were going to mention something about
The
this
time of
earlier.
the hour, Pastor?
I'm sorry?
The time
Yeah, the
was about
time.
the 6th hour.
Yeah, we're given the specific time, aren't we? Specific, right? It's the 6th hour, which probably is a reference to the noontime, I think. Yeah, Roman time. Sorry, noontime, Jewish time. All right, anything else as far as the time? Does it mention how long Jesus was there in this place? Anybody catch that?
Pastor, he stayed there for 2 days.
Yeah. Yeah, verse 40, notice it says that they stayed in Sukkar, right? They stayed in the city for 2 days. Okay. Are we given any general idea of when this occurred in the bigger picture of Jesus's ministry? Do we have any idea when this particular event took place?
Pastor, in verse 1, it was during the time when the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John.
Okay. Which would have had to have been in the Jordan, right? Because they came from Judea. Oh, by the way, we missed that physical setting that they were on their way to Galilee from Judea. That would be an important element to include on the physical setting. So I'm going to go back and include that. They were on their way from Judea to Galilee. Verse 3. Okay. So yeah, then we're told here that Jesus had been baptizing. Do we have any idea generally when this took place in Jesus's ministry? Was this at the beginning? Was it near the end? Near the middle? What do you think? Man. Well, we can start from the most general. We know from Luke 3:1 that Jesus's ministry began in the 15th year of Tiberius. Okay, so we're given from Luke a very specific date when Jesus' ministry began. All right, which some believe is around AD 27, if you look at other biblical sources. Now, the question is, when does this event in John 4 take place relative to that? Luke 4:14 and following describes Jesus's ministry in Galilee, which may have been, we don't know for sure, but maybe 6 to 12 months after his baptism. Okay, and so this story in John 4 fits somewhere between that. Okay, so this is the early part of Jesus' ministry, probably within the first year. the first year of Jesus's ministry. Okay. Now, this is something you would have to get from looking at all the Gospels and trying to figure out the chronology of it. It's important to do this for a couple reasons. One is if something took place early or later in Jesus' ministry, that could be significant as to what's going on in the story. Also, John in particular likes to mark certain stories relative to a particular feast or a specific event in Israel's history. So it would be helpful to know roughly when the story takes place. For example, if we look at, I think it's John 5, it says, after these things, there was a feast of the Jews. I don't think it was Passover in that case, but if you compare John 5 to John 6, John 6 begins with, after these things, Jesus went to the other side. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. And we can date that 6 months have passed between John 5 and John 6. All right, so that's telling us, again, John's not including every detail that happened in chronological order. He's picking certain stories, and they don't have to be things that happen right after one another. Okay? So John 4 is sometime before the feast that he mentions in John 5:1, and it's after, if we go back to John chapter 3, is it? John 2, sorry. He mentions the Passover here. So if you put together, you can kind of track. John does follow the chronology in general, but he does skip periods of time. He'll go several months between stories. So you want to keep track of where he is in generally speaking. So that will require you to get familiar with the timeline of the Gospels. A helpful book or helpful work is to look at a what do they call those, you know, when they have the passages in parallel that occur at the same time. Why am I blanking on this? You know, there's a name for it. The Gospels, when you have the harmony, like a harmony of the Gospels.
Yeah.
That can be a helpful book. Again, it's the author's opinion, but it's basically where someone's gone through the Gospels and determined like the order. So they'll have, certain chapters that maybe took place that speaking of the same event, and then they'll have basically the order of all the Gospels. And that can be a helpful tool in looking for the time setting, the setting of the time of the passage. Because again, it could be significant. Sometimes, like if Jesus made certain statements and it's close to the Passion Week, that could be significant. All right, so you just want to pay attention to that. So here, John 4 is probably in the first year of Jesus's ministry, which means less than 12 months from his baptism. Okay, that's the likely time period. And we learn that it's between the first and second Passover mentioned in John, and it is at a specific time of day. It's at noon in which this event takes place. Okay. Any other things you gleaned from John 4 as far as the time, the temporal elements of the setting? there's another reference to time in the story. Did you guys pick it up? It's toward the end. Anybody find it? There, I'm giving you a big hint. I just scrolled to it.
The harvest, Pastor.
Yes. You guys see verse 35 there? Jesus makes reference. He says, there are yet 4
Yes.
months and then comes the harvest. Okay, now, he could mean, this could have been sort of a proverbial saying at the time. You know, that the idea of some event taking place soon, you might use an idiom, which says there are 4 months and then comes the harvest. Or he could be making a specific reference to the fact that the harvest is 4 months away, the literal harvest.
Tim, but don't the first few words of verse 35 mean that he was kind of quoting proverbial saying from the Samaritans? Do you not say? So
Yeah, those are the two options. It could be that he's quoting a proverbial saying, or it can also mean, you know, would you not say at this time that it's 4 months until the harvest? It can have either one of those ideas. It can be a proverbial saying, you know, it is said there are yet 4 months and then comes a harvest. Or he could be saying, at this time, people might say there are 4 months until harvest comes. If it is, so it could be that he's just sort of quoting a proverbial saying, or it could be literal, that there are just 4 months until the harvest, which would mean that this would be in the April or May timeframe. Okay, and that would fit the timing of between the first and second Passover. But it could be either one. I tend to think it's actually a literal statement because of what he says next.
yeah, that's right.
That they're looking on the field and there is, you know, the shoots have just come up out of the ground. They've just sprouted. But he's saying, look beyond that. There actually is a harvest happening right now. But it's not a significant, it won't affect the interpretation significantly. But I think if it is literal, that would actually be a more powerful statement that he's making as he draws their attention to something, which we'll talk about later, that because the fields then would not have been, if he's telling them to literally look, lift up your eyes and look at the fields. It's not harvest time yet, right? Because they'd be looking and there'd just be these little green sprouts all over the ground. But he's saying, but there is a harvest that's ready now. So I think he's being literal. It's not a huge interpretive issue, but those would be the two options, that it's proverbial or literal. So this is what you want to keep in mind when you're considering the temporal, the time of the setting. Look for any time elements in the story. Okay, this could, verse 35 could be giving us a specific time in the story. At least what it's doing is telling us of a particular event that normally would take place, and he uses that event in order to give it a spiritual illustration. All right, you guys tracking with me? Any questions? normally if it's proverbial, he would have said, it is said, or something like that. But he could say, do you not say? It still is a possibility that's proverbial, but I think based on what he says after that, he's probably speaking literally here. And if it is literal, that's telling us
I would
that,
agree.
yeah, that's telling us that we're looking at springtime in Israel is when this happened. Okay, so those are the the physical aspects of the setting and the temporal or time aspects of the setting. Let's discuss a significant aspect of the setting, which is the cultural. That is, what are the customs, values, beliefs, attitudes within the culture of people that are in this story? Now, how do we identify the cultural aspects? Because is there anything said in the story that gives us an idea of some cultural issues or elements?
Verse 9, Pastor Tim,
Verse
the
9.
narrator adds that the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans.
Yes. That is a cultural aspect of the story. All right. Good. And that's an important one, as we'll find out. Any others in the story?
Also in verse 9, based on what the Samaritan woman said to the Lord, when she said that she was not only a Samaritan, she was a Samaritan woman. So apparently it was not proper to talk to women in public.
Yes. Yeah, and we would, so we have two issues here mentioned. There's the Samaritan Jew relationship or issue, and then there's in the Jewish culture, the male, or in the Middle Eastern ancient Near Eastern cultures, the male-female relationship. All right, which we learn from other extra biblical sources. If you remember the Talmud, remember one of the prayers of the Levites? They would say, I'm glad I am not a Gentile,
And a woman.
a Samaritan, and a woman. So they would thank God that they're not a woman. They were treated very similarly to, in some ways, how the Taliban is treating women. Not as bad, but they were looked down upon as a lower class, for sure. So here, not only we have issues with the Samaritan and Jewish relationship, but also the male and female. She's a woman. Okay, good. Anything else in the story that might show some cultural aspects?
I think
In verse 20.
Verse
Yes.
20?
Yeah, 20 and 21, it shows the differences of their way of worship as well as the location. The Jews worship in Jerusalem, the Samaritans worship in Mount Gerizim, and also the remarks of Jesus Christ that the Samaritans worship what they do not know, and the Jews worship what they do know.
Yeah, interesting statement there by Jesus, right? Jesus indicates their theological ignorance, or the theological ignorance of the Samaritans. Here. All right, good. Any others? Any other
Yes,
In
sir,
verse
Tim.
7,
verse 7?
yeah. It was the women who would draw water from the well. Men usually would not do that.
Yes. And some have said that, and this you'd have to confirm, it's just opinion, but some have said that, coming, normally they would come in the morning, get water, not at noon or in the afternoon, because it's hotter. All right, but we don't see that in the text here, so we'd have to, that would be sort of a parentheses here. Okay, anything else in the text?
Pastor Tim.
Yeah, Renee.
Can we consider verse 16 to 18 as something cultural aspect or custom social values? The relation of the issue of immorality, or having relation with a man who is not your husband.
Yeah, certainly, right? Certainly, he's pointing out something that was frowned upon, that she was, ashamed of. So the marital fidelity, even among the Samaritans. Because notice she didn't say, she said, I have no husband. She didn't say, well, I do have a man in my life. She just said, well, I don't have a husband.
Mhm.
She says, well, yeah, I know that, but you're still living with a guy. And you've had 5. So yeah, the issue of divorce comes into play here. What did the culture think about divorce? and in this case, living together, cohabitation, I think we call that these days. Okay, good. Anything else that comes out? Any other cultural elements that you guys see here? Perhaps, in reference to verse 35 again, right? It's it's an agrarian culture, so agrarian. So they work the fields, and that actually is an important element in this story. That he's not, in the city here, he's out in the countryside. Another cultural element kind of goes with verse 9 and in verse 27, right? The disciples' response, their reaction. Disciples' reaction to Jesus speaking with a woman, a Samaritan woman. And that indicates the cultural prejudice. Now, so these are elements within the story you want to look for. Also, you might want to consider then, so note anything that's said within the story, and then is anything said outside the story or in the same book that's related to these cultural issues. And for that, I'll just give you a few passages. This would be something you'd have to, John 8:48, Acts 10:28, Matthew 10:5. All of these describe the attitude of Jewish leaders towards non-Jews. If you remember Acts 10:28, right? This is when Peter said it is unlawful to be in a Gentile's house. Remember when he said that, Cornelius? He said, it's not lawful for me to be here. What? You're kidding. It's against the law, the Jews' law, for a Jew to be in the house of a Gentile.
Mm.
That kind of relates to the mentality, the mindset here. If we go to John 8:48, or I'll show you Acts 10. Here's Acts 10:28, right? You yourselves know how unlawful, it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. Then John 8:48 would be another passage. The Jews answered and said, "Do you not say rightly you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" So Samaritan, if you wanted to call somebody a name or be derogatory, you call them a Samaritan. That's like a put down. Okay, Samaritan was to call someone a Samaritan was basically like a curse word, because notice they compare it to demon. You're a Samaritan and have a demon. I mean, man, that's pretty harsh. And then finally, in Matthew 10 is another example of the cultural prejudice that the Jews had towards those who were non-Jews. Do not go the way of Gentiles or in any city of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of Israel. So that's sort of a reference there to a recognition of the cultural issues that existed. So Jesus, when he sent out the disciples, first sent them to Israel. I'm not saying Jesus was biased or prejudiced, even though there's a pastor in the US that claims Jesus repented of being racist. That's not what I'm saying. But he does recognize there are cultural issues involved here. And so their first outreach is to the people of Israel. Of course, later Jesus reaches out, right? He reaches out to the Samaritans here. He reaches out to, they go into above northern Israel, Tyre, or it's near Tyre and Sidon formerly, and minister there. But there's clearly cultural issues. And if we wanted to further expand the scope of our understanding of this, we will want to look at other passages outside the rest of Scripture, particularly in regards to the Jewish and Gentile, the Jew and Samaritan relationship. All right, so you're going to have to do a little bit of study here, because you'd have to dig into, okay, when John says Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, what did he mean by that? All right. So there is plenty of information in the Scripture. We see some references in the Gospels to the fact that Samaritans were viewed pretty poorly. We could also go to the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's another example of this issue. But 2 Kings 17, if you go there, it describes the when the 10 northern tribes were taken into exile, and then they were intermingled with Gentile nations. Then if you were to read in Ezra 4, Nehemiah 2-4, the tensions, describes the tensions between the Samaritans and the Jews. And then there are some extra biblical, if you go to Maccabees, it's not this is not a biblical inspired document, but it's a helpful piece of history that probably is fairly accurate, and it describes Israel's history between the Old and New Testament periods. And what actually happened is in Maccabees, we learn that the Samaritans had built their temple on Mount Gerizim, right, where they conducted this sort of mixed worship. Actually, in 128 BC, the Jews came and destroyed that temple. They went up into Samaria under John Hyrcanus, the guy who, if you remember the Hanukkah, right, the Feast of Lights, it celebrates the victory of the Jews over the Antioch's Epiphanes, the Seleucids, who were ruling. Remember, and he sacrificed a pig in the temple, and the Jews got mad and revolted. That whole thing. And then the celebration of that victory is Hanukkah. Well, at that same time, the Jews actually went up into Samaria, and on Mount Gerizim, they destroyed the Samaritans' temple. because there was this great fervor of religious zeal. So once they took care of Antiochus Epiphanes, they went up and destroyed. So there was a lot of tension. The Samaritans weren't so happy about that event, which would play into this whole idea of which location really is the place of true worship. So the Samaritan woman is referring to Mount Gerizim. Apparently they rebuilt the temple. But just 150 years earlier, the Jews had destroyed the temple that was on that mountain. Okay, so that's something you wouldn't learn from scripture. You'd have to find that from intertestamental period. So that's where maybe a resource might be helpful. A biblical handbook or something might point out that. But so that's not something you would be expected to know off the top of your head. But it is important to really understand sort of the history that's developed between the Jew and the Samaritan, and to see why there was this tension. And really, as we see in scripture, the references to the Samaritans, basically they were viewed as like demons. It was a very derogatory term. The Jews would shake the dust off their feet if they were able to walk in Samaria. There's just this attitude that they had towards the Samaritans. And we see some elements of that in scripture, and we realize that came about because of the history between them. If you remember in Ezra describes how when they were rebuilding the temple, how the Samaritans actually tried to make them stop. And they went to the Persian king and got him to stop the temple being rebuilt. And then later in Nehemiah's day, the same thing happened where the Samaritans tried to stop them from building the wall. They didn't want the Jews coming back and settling in and the Samaritans didn't like that. So they tried to, Nehemiah describes how they tried to stop them from building the wall. And so this history between them has been for that's what, over 500 years, there's been tension between Jew and Samaritan. All right, and that's something very important to understand going into this story of Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman. That's why I believe the cultural prejudice was the antagonist in this story, because there's such a deep history, a deep hatred, animosity, and tension between these two cultures, especially from Jew towards Samaritan. They viewed them as dirt, as scum. It was like I said, the term Samaritan was derogatory. It's like calling a black man the N-word or something. It would be just a very cruel and derogatory term that a Jew would use. So we cannot overlook that element, that cultural element in this story. It's the most significant element of this story, really. And so, any other thoughts or questions? Obviously, something like this would take a little bit of effort and study to figure out, but hopefully you would see, we want to look for clues in the story that might tell us, okay, this might be a cultural thing I really want to understand. Now, some stories there won't be that kind of thing, but like in the Good Samaritan, boy, you better understand this issue, because it is really part of the wrench that Jesus forces into this story that totally would, the term flabbergast, I mean, totally overwhelm his hearers. That in that story of the Good Samaritan, it's the Samaritan who's the good guy.
I think this is an important irony in the story, and I think this is really part of the main point that the Lord wanted to make.
Yeah, I think so. He had to pass through Samaria to talk to, of all people, an immoral Samaritan woman. Like I said before, right? He just had a conversation with Nicodemus, or John describes a conversation he had with Nicodemus in John 3, right? And Nicodemus was at the height of the Jewish culture. Pharisee, member of the Sanhedrin, and even called the teacher of Israel. So he was at the very top, you know, almost like the high priest, you know, almost to that level. He'd be the most respected, venerated, well thought of man. You know, if you're a Jew, you're thinking, wow, this guy Nicodemus, Jesus is talking to like the top level here. And then the next chapter, he's interacting with a Samaritan woman who's living in immorality. I mean, you could not get any lower in their minds. Like I said, he didn't go into the Samaritan town and just, that would have been bad enough to talk to the Samaritans. But to understand the cultural mentality here, he's talking alone, by the way, with a Samaritan woman who's immoral. I mean, that's the lowest in the Jewish mind. Basically, she's like a prostitute who is Samaritan. You remember how the Jews reacted to prostitutes, right? How the Pharisees, well, this lady, you know, is basically living like a prostitute. She's living in sexual sin, and she's a Samaritan. So, like I said, you really cannot get any further apart as far as the culture is concerned between Nicodemus and this Samaritan woman. So that is, again, I don't think one can overemphasize the significance of that, especially to this story, because again, verse 27, the disciples show up and they're like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
What is he doing? Right? So we understand
Pastor.
why they would think that.
Pastor,
Yeah.
if I may, this also gives us a picture of the deity of Christ and the purity and the holiness of Christ in relation to, of course, the Pharisees and the Jews and the Samaritans. That he is really far apart from all of these things when we realize how worthy he is indeed, as the Messiah, as the God who is deserving of true worship.
Yeah, and that makes the that discussion on worship rather very telling, very interesting within this account. Like I said last week, right? I mean, Jesus is giving some of the most profound statement on worship to this Samaritan woman. The most profound statement he made on worship in all the Gospels. Now, an interesting question. Now, how would we know what cultural aspects to consider? I mean, if we had lived at that time or near that time, we would pick up on these things right away. But we don't live in that time. So how do we know, one, what the culture is, what issues are involved, and two, how would we know that that's important to the story? What do you guys think?
Well, the first clue would be the first clue would be the narrator comments. They're the most obvious there.
Yes.
And yeah, and then the next would be similar, like as you had pointed out in Matthew 10, I think, where there are similar incidents in terms of prejudice, for example, as you read the other gospels in this case.
Yeah.
So these are hints.
And I think, though, the key is what you said at the beginning. What's going to point us in the direction of what we should consider as important is that the narrator is going to tell us, usually, that, hey, don't overlook this, or, notice this. So he'll throw these comments in, and those are going to be clues for us in the story. And so again, in this story, twice the narrator gives an allusion to the Jew-Samaritan tension. And so that points us to that. And we could probably even add that comment, that he had to pass through Samaria. That seemed to be more than just there seemed to be a purpose and intentionality there to go into this location. Okay. Now, how much of the cultural background should we incorporate into the sermon? I've heard messages on John 4 where half the message is a history of the Jews and the Samaritans. Should we mention that much? I mean, because we want to make sure to help people understand what the original audience would have understood and perceived from the story. But how would we do that in preaching this particular account? How much of the cultural background should find its way into the sermon? What do you guys think?
I think it depends on what the main point of the passage or the chapter would be, and in this case, I would give just a bit more time on the cultural background in terms of the prejudice against the Samaritans, because of what the main point of chapter 4 is. And it's really the Lord's ministering to disciples. But it's not the only issue between the Samaritans, as you mentioned. It's not only the Samaritan Jew issue. The fact that the Lord was talking to a woman alone who was an immoral person. I think when you put that all together, more or less you could already see what the Lord was trying to say to his disciples in terms of the people who needed salvation.
Yes.
So
yeah, if we could skip ahead, I mean, really, the punchline of the story is all we should bring the gospel to everyone, regardless of ethnicity, culture, and sin, lifestyle. So, in our culture, in our scenarios, talking to, sharing the gospel with a transgender waiter, maybe from another, ethnicity might be an equivalent. How we hear so much against, transgender, and it's a very perverse, twisted mind, that would pursue that. But at the same time, I think in Jesus's culture, this Samaritan woman would kind of be seen the same way. Oh, she'd stay away from her. She's a sinner. She's a Samaritan. So you would want to, I think it would help to consider any examples in the culture of the audience you're preaching to that would be equivalent. Who would be someone that people might tend to not approach or share the gospel with because they're considered too great of a sinner, or they're of those people, or so I think because of that, that seems to be a key element in this story. I think you would, I agree with Robbie, you'd want to spend a little time going into the cultural issues there. And I would say this, give just enough of the cultural background so they have an understanding. Be long enough to cover the subject, but short enough to be interesting. Okay, the ultimate goal is the author's intent. Okay, and clearly John is directing us to consider the prejudice here, because it goes right into the issue of the gospel is meant for everyone. That was the last statement made by the Samaritans, right? You're the savior of the world. And Jesus wanted the disciples to know, look, we're sent into the world with the gospel. So I would cover the subject, the cultural background, long enough so they understand, but short enough to keep it interesting. Like I said, I've heard sermons on this story where they spent, 20, 30 minutes on the Jewish Samaritan history, and this became a history lesson. And you kind of lost the bite of the story because you're, all these details about, honestly, you don't need to do that. People understand racism. They understand prejudice. It won't take you long to just say, look, these two people hated each other. And, maybe here's an event or something that might help you see why. But, the sermon's not about Jews and Samaritans. It's about Jesus approaching an unapproachable woman, at least an unapproachable person in that culture anyway. Makes sense? Questions, guys? I think we have to be careful, especially if we do a lot of study on something so we can learn about it. Our tendency might be to want to bring a lot of that into the sermon. And honestly, sometimes you might do a bunch of study and it only gets 1 minute in your sermon, but you needed to understand it so you understood the story rightly. You're the guy that has to do all the work and to understand the author's point. And sometimes that might mean you're going to study a bunch of stuff that really doesn't find its way into the sermon, but it provides the understanding you need to preach that passage accurately. See, you might even just say, in this account, look, the Samaritans, there was this great deal of racism between Jew and Samaritan. And here in America, I wouldn't need to spend a lot of time talking about that because people know what that is, and I might give an example, like I might read a verse or two, about look, here's what they called Jesus. They called him a Samaritan and a demon. So they equated it to having a demon. It was a derogatory term. Much like if I were to say in my culture, much like using the N-word to somebody, that'd be like, that's a big deal. And that alone would convey the issue. I wouldn't need to spend a bunch of time explaining how they got here, why they had this tension. That would be more for a Sunday school class or something, right? You can get into that more and have people kind of discover that. But for a sermon, you just need to make sure they at least have an understanding of the degree of prejudice that existed there. All right. Questions, comments? Okay. One last element here. We'll finish. Any other aspects of the story, the wider context? Here is just to remind ourselves this story takes place between the first and the second signs, as John notes them. Again, those signs are key markers in John's gospel. And again, it would be helpful to note the contrast within between these two signs. John describes these extended dialogues, one with Nicodemus and then the other with this Samaritan woman. And then also too, just to note, this story takes place between Jesus's ministry in Judea and his early ministry in Galilee. So, okay. I think that's enough. enough. We covered the setting here. Any questions?
Just a comment, Tim.
Yes.
I think that last point you made is very important because we have a tendency, we usually have a tendency to get excited about the things that we discover in the study. That many times, if we're not careful, the preaching could end up like a lecture.
Yeah.
Just fairly recently, since I'm doing First Samuel, I felt it was so important to look at the different locations in the narrative for me, and just not only find them in the maps, but study what these places were. And so I had a lot of information, and I had to at some point say, okay, this is really just for me, and even mentioned to the congregation as I was preaching that these places are so interesting, but if this was a lecture, I probably would go through each place in greater detail, but it's not. But I just use that to encourage those who would study Old Testament to do a little more research on the places and see them on the maps, because the movements help you understand what was happening much better. But you really have to fight the temptation to unload everything that you had studied or researched. So at least for me, it's a constant reminder.
Yeah. That's a good point. It really takes skill to know, okay, what elements here, the background of the setting, the context, the cultural practices, what elements do I need to bring up? And really, for me, the rule of thumb is if it will help me to communicate what the author's point was, then I need to bring it up. So, for example, in the story in John 4, the author is pointing to the importance of bringing the gospel to all nations. So I need to bring up this prejudice because, for a couple of reasons. One, John is focusing on it, and two, it's directly applicable to my hearers. Right? We all have prejudices, and particularly what's been happening in America in the last year and a half or 2 years with the racial tensions here. This story actually is of highly significant for what's happening in our country, my country today. So there could be a few reasons. Sometimes certain things in the passage you want to bring up just because it's applicable to your hearers. And it ties into directly to the main point of the text. So that's sort of, for me, the criteria that I look for is what will this detail will this detail help them to better understand the author's intent? Or will this detail, is it, how can I put it, is it relevant, I guess, or timely for my hearer's situation? You might be in a passage talking about rich and poor people, and there might be some important significance to that in relationship to your hearers. So those would be the two things to consider, because again, remember, expository preaching is identifying what the author meant so that we can explain to our hearers what it means. And so I've got both of those worlds that I'm considering. I have to consider the author's world because that'll help me understand his point. But then I'm also considering my hearers and their world and what will be of importance and significance to them in relation to what the author was telling in this story. So I've got both. I'm not driven by, what I think my hearers need to hear, but we are men who are to come alongside our congregation and help them apply. And so if you have a passage and there are elements in that passage that will be directly applicable to your hearers, then that's something I'm going to want to make sure I give them enough understanding of the text and the background to do that. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I want to be faithful to the original author, what God intended when it was written, and I want to be, faithful to calling my hearers to respond and helping them to know how to do that. So, okay, well, any other final thoughts before we end our time? Okay, let's keep